Author Henry Williamson is best known for his nature writing and his novel Tarka the Otter. He served in the Great War on the Western Front and wrote endlessly about the subject. Who was he, and what does his work tell us about the old front line? We've looked at Great War authors and writers in some previous episodes of the podcast. We've often used them to tie their stories, whether they be memoirs or fiction, together to help us understand a wider aspect of the landscape of the Great War, perhaps tell us something about a particular battlefield. In this podcast, I want to do something slightly different and look at one single author, and that author is Henry Williamson. I'm sitting here now looking at a pile of my Henry Williamson books on the table in front of me, the novels that he wrote about the years of the Great War. They're like old friends to me. They've been part of my Great War story, my connection to the Great War for many, many decades. And I've carried versions of them, old paperbacks, around the battlefields, and I've tramped across the ground, whether on my own or with friends, looking at those battlefields through the eyes of Williamson's writing, and often standing there reading out sections of his books that describe the part of the old front line that we're standing by. His writing is rich, it has incredible depth, and the amount of detail that you find in his books really is quite incredible. He's one of the finest Great War writers, one of the finest that we don't know, because I suspect many of you listening to this podcast have never read a book by Henry Williamson, and perhaps have never even heard of his name. He's now a forgotten voice of that war, but once this wasn't the case. In the interwar period, in the 1920s and 30s, he was a very well-known British writer, most famous for the books that he wrote about the natural world, in particular Tarka the Otter. And perhaps when I say Tarka the Otter, there will be a click. You'll realise who Henry Williamson is. That author. Did he have a connection with the Great War? I never knew. That's a common kind of reaction I get to when I talk about Henry Williamson. And Tarka the Otter was a book that resulted in being awarded the Hawthornden Prize in 1928, and it's never been out of print since. But Tarka the Otter is not about the Great War, and in that interwar period of the 20s and 30s, in particular the 30s, Williamson was one of the early voices on BBC Radio. His nature stories that he broadcast, I believe weekly, were listened to by millions of people across Great Britain and perhaps the wider then British Empire. So his work at that time saw him as a nature writer, not someone trying to capture the essence of the Great War. He did that with 2 books during that period, which we'll discuss shortly, but it was only once the Second World War was over that he really felt able to bring what he thought about that period of the Great War together in his epic A Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight, 15 novels published in the 1950s and 60s, covering a British family from Victorian times through to the period just after the Second World War. But today Williamson is largely forgotten, and there are reasons for that, which we'll discuss further on in the podcast. But how did I come across Henry Williamson? I'd never read Tarka the Otter as a child. It wasn't a book that I was familiar with, and I had no connection between either that or his name to the Great War at that time. And sometime in the 80s, in the mid-80s, I was at a car boot sale with my father. We often used to pop out on a Sunday and have a poke around in car boot sales to see what I could find from the Great War. And back in those days, there was quite a lot to find, and that generation of the Great War was then fading away, as sadly the generation of the Second World War is doing now. And all sorts of things used to turn up. And a box of books that I could see under a table, for some reason, something compelled me to pull that box out. And there was a jumble of paperback fiction in there. And then there was one hardback book, a green-covered book, and on the spine was the title, Love and the Loveless. Now that's not a phrase that we'd connect to warfare, or certainly the Great War, and I've no idea what then compelled me to pick that book up and open it, but I did. And when I did, this is what I read written on the inside of the cover. At the top, a soldier's name. Underneath, regimental number 78, 32nd and 23rd Divisions. Dear Doug, this is my favourite First War book. Mentions my division quite a lot in France and Belgium. I know all the places he writes about. He admits he was a rank coward, but like most of us kept going. I can't believe he had been in the line since 1914. He was wounded, of course, but he could not have survived all the battles he mentions. I have just written this, 16th of April 1983. So a Great War veteran had read this book by Henry Williamson and had loved it and had passed it on to one of his friends, perhaps another Great War veteran. And of course that intrigued me, and I paid something ridiculous like 50p for it and took it home and read it. And we'll talk more about Love of the Loveless further into this podcast. But that then inspired me to find out a little bit more about Henry Williamson, and I discovered on the notice board of our local library a note about the Henry Williamson Society and a member of it living in Crawley. So I went and tapped on his door, and it turned out to be a chap called Brian Fulliger, who became a lifelong friend and was my first battlefield buddy that I did an organised commercial battlefield tour with in 1987 when I was still a student. We did a tour together called Poets and Patriots, where we followed the writings of Henry Williamson and the poets of the Great War and other writers along the Western Front, and I did the history and Brian did the readings, and it was a really great experience and set me on the trail of being a battlefield guide, something I'm still doing 35 years later. So I joined the Henry Williamson Society, and it's a society that still exists. It has an excellent website, which I'll put a link to on our podcast website so you can check it out. And it publishes a journal and has meetings on a regular basis in normal non-COVID times. And what it led to was me discovering a whole world of Henry Williamson, a whole world of his writing, because aside from the books that he wrote directly about the Great War, many of his normal nature books often have references to it. So Williamson was obsessed with the war, and for Great War obsessives like us, he's an interesting and fascinating writer. But who was Henry Williamson? Henry William Williamson was born on the 1st of December 1895 at 66 Braxfield Road, Brockley in South London. His father was William Leopold Williamson and his mother was Gertrude Lever. And there was German ancestry in the Williamson family with a connection to Bavaria. Williamson spent those first years of his life at Braxfield Road. It's a place that I've been to a few times. It's only a few streets away from where David Jones, who went on to write In Parenthesis, was born. In fact, he was born in the same year as Williamson. He enlisted in the London Welsh, the 15th Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and served with them at Mametz Wood, and the poem is about his experiences there. Then he went on to become part of the mapping department of the Royal Engineers, the field survey units, and wrote extensively about that. But despite the fact that they were born so close to each other, there's no evidence that Jones and Williamson ever met each other. Henry was the middle child. He had an elder sister and a younger sister, and around about 1900 the family moved to Ladywell, not far away from Brockley, to a new road that was built on hilly fields, a bit of open ground that was part of Ladywell and very, very close to Lewisham. It's that southeast London area. And he lived at 11 Easton Road. It was a road of middle-class houses for middle-class commuters, of which his father was then one. And he grew up in quite an environment where he had the city and everything the city offered on his doorstep, but nature and the natural world was very close at hand, and the young Williamson was greatly connected to that. Henry won a scholarship to Colf's Grammar School and was there from 1907 to 1913, and of course grew up with a generation like him that would go off to fight in the Great War, but also met two fellow students there who would go on to write about the Great War like him. One of them was V.M. Yeats, Victor Yeats, who would go on to write Winged Victory, his memoir of service with the Royal Flying Corps in the Great War, and also Donald Bell, whose Diary of a Soldier of the Great War Williamson would write the introduction for and help get published in that interwar period. And then after Colf's Grammar School, he became a clerk in the Sun Insurance Company in the city, so kind of followed the example of his father to become a middle-class commuter. But in 1914, before the war, he enlisted in the 5th Battalion of the London Regiment, the London Rifle Brigade. A lot of young men of his generation in London were joining the Territorials. There were 20-odd different battalions scattered around London, each with their own drill halls, and there was quite a push in that period from 1908 onwards with the formation of what was then the Territorial Force to create Saturday night soldiers, part-time soldiers who could be mobilised in time of war, because many felt that some kind of European conflict was looming close, and of course they were right. So Williamson joined them and did sessions as a soldier with them before the Great War, and on the outbreak of the war in August 1914, he was with the battalion at their annual camp at Crowborough in Sussex, and they were mobilised for war. Now the 5th London Regiment, the London Rifle Brigade, they had a very high proportion of men who'd volunteered to serve overseas. They'd signed the Imperial Service Declaration, so they became one of the first territorial battalions to be sent overseas in 1914. And Williamson went with them to Flanders in November of that year, and as such was awarded the 1914 Ormonde's Star, something that he was very proud of in later life, and it's a medal that still survives within the Williamson archive. The key event that Williamson would take part in 1914 was the Christmas truce, and there is an iPlayer episode of him talking about that from the Great War series in the 1960s, and it's also on YouTube. So I'll embed a copy of that YouTube video of him talking about the Christmas truce onto the podcast website, so you can listen to that, watch that as a follow-up. And it demonstrates just what a great orator Williamson was. His descriptions of the Great War, when he talks about it, they really are quite incredible and incredibly moving as well. The experience of the Christmas truce changed Williamson's life. He never thought about the war, and he never thought about German soldiers in the same way again. Something was broken in him as a soldier. He would fight to the end, serve to the end, but he viewed the war in a different way and would continue to view it in that way for the rest of his life. I've had the pleasure and the honour of meeting both of Williamson's wives and many of his children, and one thing that comes across is that for them as a family, Christmas, which should have been a time of great celebration and joy, was often a morose time where their father or their husband, depending on who I was talking to, threw himself into a black depression caused by the memories of the humanity that he experienced on that Christmas day and the inhumanity that he experienced in the rest of the war. He was a complex man, Henry Williamson. In early 1915, he got dysentery and was sent home. And then he applied for a commission as an officer. Being a grammar school boy, more and more of that type of young man was stepping forward to become an officer in the British Army. And Williamson got a commission in the Bedfordshire Regiment, which he calls the Wiltshires in many of his books. But recurring sickness kept him in Britain until in late 1916 he transferred to the Machine Gun Corps and was posted as transport officer to the 208th Machine Gun Company in the 62nd West Riding Division. And he went across with them after training at Grantham, the Machine Gun Corps Training Centre. He went across with them to the Somme in the winter of 1916-17 and served with them in the Ancre Valley. This was one of his longest periods of service. It took him from the end of the Somme campaign through that harsh winter of 1916-17 and onto the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line and the battles around Bullecourt during the Battle of Arras in April and May of 1917. And then in the summer of that year, dysentery returned once more, and Williamson found himself back home and in hospital. And he didn't return to the front again, this time no longer in the Machine Gun Corps, but back with the Bedfordshire Regiment, 2nd Battalion, the Bedfordshire Regiment, during the Kaiserschlacht in March of 1918, when he's posted back to France as a replacement officer for the losses sustained in the early period of that German attack. And he stays with them sometime up until the middle part of April of 1918, takes part in the Battle of the Lys around Kemmel, and then he goes home again, and his war on the Western Front is over. On Armistice Day, he was at Langard Camp near Felixstowe, And he described later on in both writing and in a radio broadcast how the news of the end of the war came round and the officers in the camp went mad, rushed into the sea, they were firing flares up into the dark night sky, and he sat there and thought about the Western Front, about the war there that he'd known for all those years of his young life had come to an end, and how the battlefields would now be silent, no longer the crump of shells and the staccato of the machine gun and the crack of rifles, no longer the green and red of flares as he was seeing them that night above the Suffolk coast. The battlefields would now be silent, and he couldn't imagine that silence somehow. And even in it he could hear this raging voice of his dead comrades urging him never to forget. And for him a simple statement: never again. It must never happen again. And that's something that drove Williamson, really, for much of the rest of his life. Demobilised in September 1919, he came out of the army knowing that he wanted to write. And this is something that he wrote much later, which he entitled When I Was Demobilised, and it appears in Anne Williamson's, his daughter-in-law's, excellent biography of Williamson's wartime story, which I'll put a link to on the podcast website. And this is what he says: "It was then that I felt lost. For all my years since boyhood, a very long time to me, the army had been my home. Indeed, it had been my entire grown-up world. Now I had no world except the shadowy and diminished sphere of civvy life, which had been steadily dissolving since 1914. I could hardly speak to my parents. There were hardly any light rays between our worlds. I remember going slowly around the streets of Sydenham, wondering what I could do. At last I went to London to stay in a hotel and visit some of my wartime haunts. But I might have been a ghost. I drank beer alone, yet with imaginary comrades. I wrote at night and loafed about during the day. I ran into some of my friends and we hailed one another with cries of happiness. It was a strange world. There was an ex-officers' association to which I and a friend went, putting down our names for jobs, any jobs, at home or abroad. We learnt that what we were in the army was of little use in the new world. We were now becoming accustomed to this. Gradually we were absorbed into the post-war. The battlefields were cleared up. Tens of thousands of Poles and Italians filled in the craters with long-handled shovels. Tens of thousands of rusty dud shells and fragments of steel were collected into dumps. We used to say during the war that it would take 100 years to clear up the Somme battlefields. As for the human souls that once trudged there, in sweat and terror, in cold and mud, and in heat and choking dust, they too became in time indistinguishable from the civilian world of which they had once been so derisive. So it came about that I left London and went to live in a cottage in Devon by myself, to meditate and to write the truth as I saw it, to clarify what we fought and died for, a new vision of the world." Williamson's life then took him off into the Devon countryside in the village of Georgeham, and later he'd become a farmer in Norfolk. And in that interwar period, although he tried many times to write about his experience of the Great War, it only evolved into 2 published books, both of which are fantastic Great War books to read. The Wet Flanders Plain, published in 1929, describes his journeys to the battlefields at that time, a fascinating insight into the aftermath period. And then he wrote a novel, Patriot's Progress, in 1930. This is about John Bullock, Private 19053. And I mention this as a bit of Great War geekery because Williamson deliberately chose that regimental number, 19053, because in her private's Private Bourne's number was 19052. And I think it was a kind of subtle connection between those 2 books. Patriot's Progress was about an ordinary soldier conscripted into the war and wounded at Passchendaele. And the end of the book is incredibly powerful and I think shows the bitterness that Williamson and many veterans at that time felt when they looked at the post-war world and what it had become. Many of them asked, and all for what? John Bullock is standing there in London as the war comes to an end, alongside a toff, smoking a cigar, and this is how Williamson describes it. However, said the old gentleman, giving him a cigar as he prepared to move on to see the fun. Whistles were blowing, people shouting and singing, motor horns honking, and a deuce of a fine old row everywhere. We always did do things in England by halves. At this moment a very little boy ran up, waving a flag, and seeing his daddy talking to someone, he stopped. "Look, Daddy, look!" cried the little boy. "The poor man hasn't got only one boot on." "Shush! You mustn't notice such things," said the toff. "This good man is a hero. Yes," he went on, "we'll see that England doesn't forget you fellows." "We are England," said John Bullock with a slow smile. The old gentleman could not look him in the eyes, and the little boy ceased to wave his flag and stared sorrowfully at the poor man. But Williamson put aside thoughts of the trenches and the Western Front for farming as another world war approached, and during that war he spent much of it on the land. After the war he returned to writing and finally began this epic attempt at writing a 15-novel sequence following the story essentially of his own family, fictionalised in 15 novels. From the Victorian times when his parents first met, through to an Edwardian childhood, the Great War, the interwar period, the experience of another conflict, and then the main character would emerge from that like a phoenix and begin writing this incredible war and peace of the first half of the 20th century. These novels were known collectively as a Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight, and it's them we'll look at next. There are quite likely millions of words in A Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight, those 15 novels that Williamson wrote about the experience of a British family from Victorian times through the Great War to the end of a Second War. And you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to attempt to read them all here. It would take up thousands of podcasts. But what I want to do is look at the 5 novels that cover the Great War and talk a little bit about them, and pop in some readings that will give you an essence of the kind of writing that Williamson did in these books and how it ties greatly to the Great War Western Front landscape that we know today, and how it's rewarding to visit that landscape with Williamson tucked in your knapsack and with one of his books. Williamson obviously doesn't use his own name in these novels. His persona is Philip Madison, and it's the Madison family, from the parents meeting and courting in Victorian times through to their marriage, through to the arrival of their children, through to them being middle-class Victorians in the lead-up to the Great War, and middle-class Edwardians as well, of course, and then the experience of the war. And those 5 Great War novels follow Philip Madison from a young 18-year-old soldier, pretty naive about the world, through to his experiences in the final phase of the war in 1918. And the first of those novels is How Dear Is Life. Now, I have first editions of all of these with the dust wrappers on, and the dust wrappers are quite important, which I'll mention for some of them. Some are better than others, I would say, but there are modern editions of these, and they're not difficult to get hold of on places like eBay. So it's quite easy to get hold of these books, and you can get paperback editions from the 1970s for just a few pounds, and it is worth just dipping into one to have a sense of what Williamson is like. So the first of the Great War novels is called How Dear Is Life, and it begins in London with Philip Madison, the main character, has just left school. He's got a job with an insurance company, as Williamson himself did do at this time, and he's joined a local territorial battalion. Now, Williamson fictionalised that as well. He didn't use the London Rifle Brigade. He used the phrase London Highlanders because he wanted to weave in a greater story, and that's the whole purpose of these novels, not just to tell the story of his own life, but to tell a bigger story. And you remember that account from the veteran who wrote in that copy of Love and the Loveless that I had, where he remarked upon the fact that it was impossible for the character to have survived all these battles. Of course, that was true, but Williamson was trying to tell that bigger picture and stretch our credulity, if you like, of a man surviving all those battles, but for an important reason, to tell the big picture of the Great War. So he joins the London Highlanders and is in Sussex when the war breaks out, and they go to war and they're mobilised, and that takes them to the front. And because he chose the London Highlanders, which was quite a crude way of describing the London Scottish, the battle that takes place in this book is the battle at Messines on the 31st of October 1914, when in reality the London Scottish became the first territorial infantry battalion to see action in the Great War, and Williamson used that to tell the story of the First Battle of Ypres, essentially. So this is his description of the fighting at Messines. The moon of Halloween, one night away from its full shine, sailed high in the sky, so that figures of men, whether standing or lying, moving or still, complete or broken into pieces, cast the smallest shadows upon the earth. But such quality of observation vanishes like tissue paper in flame when high explosive detonates and a man is exposed to his own frail aloneness. Philip leapt down into the trench when with swoop and swish German shrapnel began to crack above. High explosive followed shrapnel. The timeless night roared on. Cries came feebly through the choking fumes. Showers of sparks and fiery tongues rose from the stacks west of the road. The windmill blazed until its arms dropped to pieces with running blazing tar. The shell sunk low, while yet the farm near it was lurid with flame. With the glare behind them, the survivors in trench and rifle pit were appalled by a sudden great burst of cheering, prolonged and repeated, and to the striking up of Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, the Bavarians attacked again. The rows of faces were lit by flames as they ran forward, to fall before a rapid thudding rifle fire. Philip could hear their officers shouting. He saw one run forward until he stumbled upon his face, sword in hand. Then from Messines came the steady pop, 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 clack, clack, of traversing machine-gun fire. More than one was enfilading the line of the trenches. Parapet and parados, or what served for them, seemed to jerk viciously in places, sending spurts of dirt upon them. When the machine-gun stopped firing, there was more shouting, another rush, some of the attacking figures leaping from side to side, but never coming really near. Others lay down and started to fire. There were only a few flashes here and there, and as the flames behind the trench sank down, the attack seemed to be called off. Whistles were blown, shouts were heard. Philip felt himself suddenly to be feeble. When you read the books, and this is typical of that kind of description, you often feel that Philip Madison is caught up in the greater events around him, that he's not so much part of them, that he's being drawn into their vortex and is there to observe them. And the fear and isolation of the soldier in combat is something that Williamson really puts across in much of his writing. How Dear His Life concludes with the fighting at the end of the First Battle of Ypres, what Williamson calls the Battle in the Brown Wood Line, where the London Highlanders suffer heavy casualties and then they're out of the trenches at Balliol. Williamson in these books goes into a lot of detail about kit, equipment, what it was like in the estaminets, marching down the roads, and it gives a kind of depth to the First World War that you don't always find in contemporary fiction, simply because Williamson could recall his own memories of it and fall back on the memories of men that he knew who'd served alongside him. He had a massive Great War library, almost everything that was published in the 20s and 30s, and luckily I had a chance to see that before it was transferred as an archive to Exeter University, and you could see what his influences were in the books. So he drew not just on his own experiences, but on the many experiences of others to tell this greater story. The next novel in the Great War series within the Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight is called A Fox Under My Cloak, and I'm looking at my edition, first edition of this now with the dust wrapper, and it shows poppies and barbed wire and the shattered ruins of a village and a slag heap in the background and the tall towers of Tower Bridge at Lewes. And this is a novel very much set in that period of the war. But it begins in Flanders in late 1914 with the Christmas truce, that great event that so absorbed Williamson for all of his life, and Philip Madison takes part in it. In a chapter he calls Heiligenacht, Williamson wrote, "Sometime in the night Philip saw what looked like a light on top of a pole put up in the German lines. It was a strange sort of light. It burned almost white and was absolutely steady. What sort of lantern was it? He did not think much about it. It was part of the strange unreality of the silence of the night, of the silence of the moon in the sky, of the silence of the frost mist. He was warm with the work, all his body was in glow, not so much with warmth, but with moonlight. Suddenly there was a short, quick cheer from the German lines. "Hock, hock, hock!" And with the others he flinched and crouched, ready to fling himself flat. But no shot came from the enemy lines. They talked about it, for other cheers were coming across the blank space of no man's land. Then they saw dim figures on the German parapet, about more lights, and with amazement he saw that it was a Christmas tree being set there, and around it were Germans talking and laughing together. "Hock, hock, hock," they were cheering. The next day Philip finds himself involved in the Christmas truce. Philip, leaning the bicycle against the British barricade, walked into no man's land and found himself face to face with living Germans, men in grey uniforms and leather knee boots, a fact which was, as yet, almost unbelievable. Moreover, the Germans were actually, some of them, smiling as they talked in English. He hurried to be among them, and saw one writing his name and home address, to exchange it with an English name and address. They'd agreed to write to one another after the war. Most of the Germans were small men, rather pale of face. Many wore spectacles, and had thin little goatee beards. He did not see a pickelhaube. They were either bare-headed or had on a small grey pork pie hat with red bands, each with 2 metal buttons ringed with white, black and red, rather like tiny archery targets. "They're Saxons," a bearded soldier told him. "They watched some of the London Islanders, your lot, mate, putting up a fence last night, but they wouldn't fire, he told me, even if they were ordered to. Or if they were forced to, like, they said they'd fire I saw the Christmas tree they put up after singing carols. Not a bad lot of bleeders if you ask me, mate." Among the smaller Saxons were tall, sturdy men, taking no part in the talking, but moving about singly, regarding the general scene with detachment. They were red-faced men, and Philip noticed that their tunics and trousers above the leather knee boots showed dried mud marks. Looking in the direction of the mass of Germans, Philip could see, judging by the rows of figures standing there, at least 3 positions of trench lines behind their front line, at intervals of about 200 yards. One of the small Saxons was contentedly standing by himself, smoking a new and large pipe. He wore large spectacles and looked just like a comic paper Hun. Philip noticed that the white bowl of the pipe had the face and high-peaked cap of Little Willie painted on it. The Saxon saw him looking at his pipe, and taking out of his mouth, he said with quiet satisfaction, "Kronprinz, praktischer Kerl," as he looked at the portrait and wagged his thin black little goat's beard in approval before putting the mouthpiece back carefully between his teeth and puffing to keep the tobacco alight. This done, he moved the pipe, examined the bowl, rubbed it against his nose, and went on smoking. In this fictionalised account of the truce, Williamson, using the fiction, is able to tell the bigger picture story again by bringing in different angles in a way that a straight memoir would not be able to do. And in it he has Philip taking a bicycle ride behind the German trenches, something that would have been pretty much impossible, although we know that on Christmas Day 1914, in reality, some men were captured by the Germans that day for venturing too deeply into their trench system. But Philip goes on this ride and he sees the German lines and a German gun battery, and he sees the British positions beyond and comes back. And that experience of the truce, of seeing the Germans, of making the enemy real, is something that stays not just with Williamson in real life, but stays with this character throughout the rest of the war experience that he has. In 1915, Philip is sent home with sickness, and he's then commissioned into the Gultsheers, which is Williamson's name for the Bedfordshire Regiment, and he's sent out to take part in the Battle of Lewes, but not as an infantry officer, as an attached officer to the gas units, the Special Brigade. And Williamson uses that position to enable that character to get about the battlefield in a way that a normal infantry officer wouldn't do, and see more of it, and enabling Williamson to describe more of the battlefield of Lewes. So here's a point in which Philip gets up to view the battlefield for the first time. The captain showed him a trench map. The German lines lay just over the crest of the slope, rising across the wide and grassy wilderness of no man's land. The Hun can see us against the skyline when we go out on patrol, particularly when the moon is going down. We can't see him because the ground rises again out of the Lewes Valley behind his front line. To the south, the British lines lay up another slope, with no man's land an imperceptible hollow in front. Behind the enemy front line was Hill 69, rising to the skyline, and the much-wired Lewes Road redoubt. Farther on, to the south, and in the direction of Lewes, with its upstanding colliery gear, the German lines lay on and behind some more rising ground. Dominating the view was a tall structure in lacework iron of twin pylons surmounted by a flat top, called by the men the Tower Bridge. It arose high above a red brick village with a church. That was Lewes, one of the main objectives of the attack, which had to be captured in the first rush. Behind it was the large town of Lens, which was never shelled since the civilian population was still there, working for the old Hun. Later in the book, Philip gets into Lewes and he gets to the Tower Bridge and goes up it. He stood up and saw an open iron door half hidden by scrap metal in between the feet of the towers. Insinuating himself there, he saw an iron stairway leading upwards, spiral and very narrow, enclosed by sheet iron. It was like the iron staircase up to the mezzanine room between the town department at head office and the director's floor. It was with thoughts of past days that Philip started to climb the iron stairs. Round and round he went, his feet sometimes fumbling at a tread, not daring to look down or to think of what would happen if a shell made a direct hit on it. Shrapnel had struck it many times, hundreds of jagged holes were in the boilerplate walls. He paused for breath, to ease the ache in his legs while the dim tube whispered hugely of the noises of battle. Then whang! The blow went right through him as a splinter of woolly bear opened an eyelid-shaped space 6 feet above his eyes. After hesitation, he decided that the law of averages, no shell ever fell exactly in the same shell hole as another, would protect him, so he climbed on to rest again a dozen yards higher up and to see large gaps in the boilerplate above him. Would that bare space be watched by a sniper? Why were there no British observers up the tower? Perhaps because they could see all they needed for the moment from their old OPs in Morocco and the huge Crassier near Vermelles with telescopes. He came to the top of the staircase and found himself on an iron floor strewn with shell splinters and broken glass. He was in a circular room like a turret with breast-high windows all round. Cold wind moved past him from the empty spaces with their serrated glass edges. He began to tiptoe around the platform under the steel roof. At the far end was a table with one leg fractured, leaning sideways. Below it was a small pile of newspapers, apparently slidden off, with an empty wine bottle and a piece of dry black bread, and in one corner a single grey Zeiss glass. He picked it up, screwed the adjustment, and saw that it was unbroken. What luck! He put it on the table, and took up a newspaper, making out the thickly carved German letters, Berliner Tageblatt. He went to the dangerous side of the tower, towards the Germans, after covering his face with his khaki handkerchief to blend with the rusty iron. North lay the shallow valley between Lone Tree Ridge and the crest of the Lens Bethune Road, with its lengths of coppice concealing the machine guns which had cut up the attack of the day before, and farther down the valley, into which the straight road dipped, lay the brown cluster of hullock, and beyond it a stream in a green valley with trees in full foliage just beginning to turn to the colours of autumn. Farther away and beyond 5 miles or so lay La Bassée and the canal. West of La Bassée lay smaller Auchy, and this side of it miners' cottages, Coron, near the big sullen dump, and a tall chimney by the pit head, and in front of it, semicircular in a dressing of sulky chalk, wreathed in the smoke of many shells, lay the Hohenzollern redoubt, which had been taken and lost, and was now being attacked again, judging by the white British shrapnel smoke over it. He saw Vermelles, comparatively untouched by shell fire, and the big grey pyramid that was the Crassier at Philosophy, tunnelled along its peak for shrapnel-proof observation posts. Back behind the British lines lay the tall slag heaps of Neuilly-les-Mines, the square tower of Bethune, and the dark mass of a wood. How small and remote everything seemed. It's descriptions like that are in many of the books that really connect us to the landscape of the Great War, and I think it's one of the things that had always has endeared me to Williamson's work is his vivid descriptions of what the battlefields were like. He puts Philip into places that probably no soldier ever went. Who would climb the wreckage of the Tower Bridge to try and get up there with shells whizzing around? But it enables Philip to get up there and see the battlefield in its entirety. After Loos, Philip Madison goes home again, and he returns to the Western Front in the early summer of 1916 in time for the Battle of the Somme. And that's the next volume of the war books, called The Golden Virgin. The Golden Virgin is the Somme volume of the Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight, and it's one of my favourite dust wrappers. I'm looking at it now. It's got the shattered tree-lined road of the Albert-Bapaume road that runs right through the heart of the Somme battlefields. It's called the Golden Virgin after the church, the basilica in Albert, with the figure of Mary with her outstretched arms holding the infant Jesus, and that figure hung at a crazy angle from the top of the tower of the basilica, and that's depicted on the cover and also on the spine of the book as well. And this follows Philip Madison, now back as an infantry officer, into the attack on the 1st of July, an attack that Williamson fictionalised based on the accounts of the men who fought in Mash Valley. It's about the advance up Mash Valley and the blowing of the Wysap mine just outside the village of La Boisselle. It was an attack that would go disastrously wrong, and this account in the chapter called The Cakewalk, and the Cakewalk was a phrase used in 1916 to describe just how easy this assault was going to be. You just have to walk across no man's land and occupy the enemy positions beyond. Bapaume by nightfall, Berlin by Christmas. But it had gone terribly wrong, with heavy casualties, one of them being Philip Madison, and this is Williamson's description of that. Philip was then lying down in no man's land with the fragments of his platoon. He had been going forward carrying the Lewis gun which Sergeant Jones had dropped on being hit, when an apparition in coils of white smoke had run to him, screaming to be saved. It collapsed and hung to his legs. The sandbag of phosphorus grenades carried by Howells had caught fire to enclose him in crackling loops and spurtings of white thick smoke. His tunic smouldered, fuming ulcers ate into his flesh. He ran to his officer for help. Philip tried to knock away phosphorus fragments like broken nuts, which were dividing and subdividing on Howe's uniform and equipment. His efforts were in vain. Shrieking, Howells began to roll and squirm upon the ground. Philip was about to turn the Lewis gun on him when he felt himself to be scalded all down his left leg. He saw Pym sitting up, the water can torn open a few yards away, and thought that a shell had burst near and heated the water to steam, which had scalded him. He was now behind the front wave, and seeing this he hurried on. Shouldering the Lewis gun, he tried to catch up, raging and cursing incoherently beyond the fury of fear, followed by hoarsely yelling men. He turned to tell them with gestures of his free arm not to bunch, to spread out. They would draw more fire, when he felt a terrific blow on his behind and fell over. He thought that he had been struck by a piece of shell coming from afar. The weight of iron had knocked him over and numbed his leg. Obsessed with the idea of getting on with the Lewis gun to give covering fire for his platoon, he started to get up, but his leg gave way, as though it were not there. The lump of iron had obviously numbed a nerve. He lay a few moments, waiting for strength to come back. When it did not, he crawled into the crater of a shell, which had blackened the cracked chalk. He must catch up with the few figures advancing through the smoke in front. The nerves of his leg were still numbed, so he tried to raise the Lewis gun upon its steel prong in order to give covering fire from the lip of the crater, but he could not lift it so far, and this made him cry. Lying back, he realised that his trouser leg was soaked, not with water, but with blood. Thinking his journey's end had come, Philip is rescued by an army chaplain, Father Aloysius, and Williamson concludes this chapter with a cold statement. The glacis between the fortress of Overlers and La Boisselle was strewn with men of all misshapes and sizes, lying amidst blind shells of many calibres. Later, the corps assessment of casualties in the division, which had attacked immediately north of the Bapaume road, were 99 officers and 1,822 other ranks killed, with 92 officers and 3,003 men wounded. One of those was Philip when he goes back to Britain, recovers from his wounds, And as he recovers, the Battle of the Somme is coming to an end, and that's where the book ends, with the thoughts of troops returning to the Somme front, and leads us into the fourth of the Great War novels that Williamson wrote in this series, Love and the Loveless, the first one that I read when I found it all those years ago. Love and the Loveless has got the least exciting dust wrapper of all of the Chronicle novels. Some of the later editions actually I think have better dust wrappers than the original. But in this one, Philip transfers to the Machine Gun Corps and he becomes a transport officer with the mules and the donkeys. And that takes him to the Ancre Valley in the cold winter of 1916-17, which Williamson described in the BBC series and also in great detail in this novel. In real life, Williamson was a transport officer, but by making Philip Madison one as well, again it gives him that ability to move around a battlefield area in a way that a man commanding a platoon probably wouldn't have done, so he gets to see a lot more things, enabling Williamson to describe them. This leads Philip Madison and the men of the 286 Machine Gun Company, in reality the 208, to the battles along the Hindenburg Line at Bullecourt in April and May of 1917. And Williamson himself witnessed those, the loss of the men of the West Riding Division, local lads from here in Barnsley, the York and Lancs, and lads from Sheffield in the Hallamshires, and the men from the Duke of Boots, the Duke of Wellingtons, who also fought there. And the book takes in quite a few battles, in fact more battles in this volume than any of the others. Messines in June, and then the Third Battle of Ypres, and also Cambrai. Williamson leaves us some great descriptions of what Philip sees on his travels, and this is him at Messines coming up to the Spanbroek-Molen mine crater. They pass by the ragged mine crater at Spanbroek-Molen. It was about 150 yards from lip to lip and deeper than the German dugouts, for one was exposed at the edge with its occupants. Looking through his field glasses, Philip saw what was like something at Madame Tussaud's, a boarded room with one side open, revealing 4 German officers seated at a table, with waxen faces. They looked as though they had been playing cards. Glasses and bottles on the table were still upright. Apparently they'd been killed by concussion. In the pit below were ragged lumps of blue clay, each big enough to fill a GS wagon. But one of my favourite episodes in the book is when Philip, with his old friend Spectre West, Captain and then later Major and later Brigadier General West, is a central character in the book, a brave man highly decorated with the DSO and the MC, with rosettes upon both ribbons indicating that he'd been awarded it more than once. He's Philip's hero, really, the man that Philip looks up to, and he encounters him first at Lewes and then in many of the other battles besides. And here, Spectre West is a staff officer going up to see how the attack on Passchendaele is going during the Third Battle of Ypres in October 1917. And they follow a route up to Tyne Cot along the old railway line. And every time I cross that, going up to the cemetery with a ledger group or walking that ground, I think of this route of Philip and Westy moving up. And this is Williamson's description of it. After another visit to brigade headquarters, Spectre West made his way, followed by Philip, along the Zonnebeek Road for about a mile. Timber bulks were being laid beyond the dressing station at Hill 40. Behind the rise they turned left-handed, past the ruins of the station, and made directly for the line. Tired bullets buzzed and sighed down. The ground, which was sandy and made fair going, had been in enemy hands less than a week before. German dead, fully equipped, even to hairy cowhide packs, lay everywhere, some still holding bayoneted rifles. They were the Sturmtruppen of the 4th Reserve Guards Division, whose attack on the 4th of October, set for 6:10 a.m, had been boxed up by the Australians, who had attacked at 6 a.m. "Where are we going, Westy?" "I'm going as far as I can without being shot. Do you wish to turn back?" "No, mein prächtig Kerl. What about a spot of lunch?" "Not for me. This is the ruler's railway embankment." He looked at his map case. "Just north of the Neuenmolen railway crossing at Tyne Cot. The Germans still hold the Flandern 1 position. The 2nd West Pennine Division holds this sector, and I want to see how far they've got." He did not say that the 5th step, planned to be taken in less than 48 hours, was based on the assumption that the wire was non-existent, and that the last of the Mannschafts Eisenbeton Unterstander, Mebus to the staff, pillbox to the fighting soldier, had already been captured. The railway entered what had been a cutting, but now was a prolonged mounding of earth like a scar, strung with wild loops of half-buried rusty wire in the slope of rising ground to the skyline. A German trench crossed the cutting. This, said a notice, was Daring Crossing, the Red Line. The trench had been deep and revetted with posts and rough basket work of willow, but the bombardment of the previous week had smashed, buried, and upturned most of it. A muddy, twisted tape lay along it. They must now be close to the front line, thought Philip, following behind Spectre West. Did he know where he was going? If the attack the day before had failed, wasn't this still the front line? As though the same thought had come to him, the older man stopped and looked at his map. They continued and made a scramble over the yellow, sandy soil, on top of which was a clear view of a straight road with tree stumps and broken cottages along a line which ended at a tower startlingly high. There in front was Passchendaele. That character of Spectre West is based on a lot of real people, some of the officers of the Bedfordshire Regiment that Williamson knew in the earlier period of the war and then in the spring offensive of 1918, but also loosely, I think, based on Adrian Carton de Weert VC. The physical appearance of Spectre West is very much like him. Williamson was trying to pay tribute to the men like that who really went out of their way to court danger, to get to the front line, to see what needed to be seen and report back. Men who led by example and often paid for that example with their lives. You feel throughout Williamson's books that he is paying tribute to this entire generation, that he looks at men from all sorts of different angles, humble privates from working class backgrounds through to public school educated officers. It's his way, I suppose, of honouring that myriad of faces of the Great War that he saw and never forgot. The final and fifth novel in the Great War part of the Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight is called A Test to Destruction, and it's about 1918, the final year of the war. Its front cover of the original edition doesn't look that exciting, but when you look at the spine, there's the symbol of what Williamson calls the mud-balled fox, which is the red fox with a light white patch on its tail, the symbol of the Fifth Army commanded by General Gough, who stood their ground, tried to stand their ground during that March offensive on the Somme and near St. Quentin in March 1918. Williamson was a member of the Fifth Army Association, a proud member of it, something that he often wrote about in much of his other writing. And on the back of the book is a Neveson drawing that was specially done for Williamson, and one of the C.R.W. Neveson, one of the war artists, and one of the figures in it is said to be Williamson himself, the central figure. The Williamson archive has the original of this, but it's, I think, a piece of war art that will be familiar to those interested in the war artists of the Great War. In this book, A Test to Destruction, Philip finds himself back as an infantry officer now with the 2nd Gultshires, the 2nd Bedfordshires, which Williamson did serve with during this period. And this is his description of what happened to them near St. Quentin. The escape of the 2nd Gultshires from the Bois de Gourlou was ragged as it was hurried. Germans were advancing through the centre of the wood. As they got through to open space, a machine gun began to fire blindly into the thinning mist. The bullets passed over their head. There was no attempt to give covering fire. They fled, to be met with rifle fire from unseen troops lining a road in front of them. They went prone, the firing ceased, and Bill Kidd's voice was heard shouting through the mists, "Don't be such bloody twats! Come on, you crab-wallers!" They went on to see Kidd talking to a major of pioneers, who with an assortment of non-combatants, as Kidd later said, had come up from the canal. "That's where we're due, old boy. I've got all the dope from Spectre, and was on my way to tell you." He and Philip examined the map. About there, bullets now buzzing past. "We ought to get a move on, old boy. If the fog lifts, we'll be in full view of Jerry, as the ground slopes up from here. Where's Spectre?" "Over there, across the canal, just this side of the river. Christ, that sounds like the bridge being blown up." An echoing rumble had come from the west. "We'll have to swim for it, old boy." And Williamson's fictionalised account of this fluid part of the Great War, with the German advance and the British retreat, and then comparing that with the experience of Philip up in Flanders gives us a good insight into this period, this spring of 1918. Philip's mustard gassed during the fighting near Kemmel. Spectre West is wounded in the leg, and they're both evacuated back to the base and then across on a hospital ship, which is then torpedoed and sinks. Philip survives, is dragged into a lifeboat, but Spectre West is drowned. His great hero has gone, and Philip returns home, recovers from his wounds just as the war comes to an end. You get the sense that Philip Madison, just like Williamson was in this period, feels very much alone. That final year of the war, as the book suggests, was a test to destruction. It had pushed him to his limits. But through writing he now saw another way, a new way ahead, of immortalising the men that he'd served with what he called his comrades in ancient sunlight. And he ends the book with this: Philip turned back feeling a sense of power with which to face the future, because now he understood what had not always been clear in the past. No man could be destroyed once he had discovered poetry, the spirit of life. And it's that spirit of life, that poetry, that takes Philip Madison, and indeed took Henry Williamson, into the years that followed as he struggled and he searched and he tried to find a way of describing that generation. And many novels into the Chronicle, I've read them twice in my lifetime and will try and read them again. 15 novels in one go is quite something, but worth the perseverance. But it ends with that 15th novel, with Philip Madison, now a middle-aged man, looking back to his comrades lost in ancient sunlight and realising that that time had come to put his thoughts, to put his words down on paper, to write that War and Peace of the Great War. It's been a long episode, this, and to be honest, with Williamson's writing I could go on and on, but look for the books, try and read one. It's incredible writing. But coming back to what we said in the very beginning of the podcast, why isn't Williamson better known? Everyone has dark corners of their life, and Williamson had those. In the 1930s, he joined the British Union of Fascists. As some of you know, my grandmother's family from Paris were murdered in the Holocaust, so I'm no apologist for the Nazis. But when I look at Williamson's writing, I don't find anything that is overtly or even obviously anti-Semitic. Williamson was drawn into the idea of the British Union of Fascists in some respects because of the Great War. He was obsessed with the idea that veterans of that war would never want to go to war again. And when he saw Hitler taking control of Germany and men like Mosley leading a party in Britain, he felt that with veterans like those in power and talking to each other, another war was impossible. Williamson was incredibly naive in this, and it was something that did great damage to his life and reputation, because when Britain did go to war in 1939, Williamson was among many people who were detained. He spent a short period, only a very short period, in a police cell before he was released back home to his farm. But his membership of the British Union of Fascists, his continued friendship with Mosley after the war, and his detention in 1940, I think really put a dark stain on his reputation for the rest of his life. Considering what he achieved as a writer, he was never formally recognised for this, and it's got to be because of his involvement with the BUF in the 1930s. So it's part of his character and part of his life that we cannot ignore. We should not ignore. We need to know these things. And although he retained a writing contract after the war, and MacDonald published a Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight in the 1950s and 60s, in many respects during this time, Williamson was in the wilderness. He was forgotten as a writer, forgotten as a broadcaster. He came back into the fore again in the 50th anniversary of the Great War in the 1960s when he was interviewed for the Great War series. He appears in several of the episodes, and he was commissioned by newspapers to return to the battlefields and walk the front line and write about it, which he did do. His first marriage to Letitia had ended in divorce, and he was married again, but this was the last decade of his life, not Williamson's finest period, in which he gradually deteriorated until his death in 1977. Williamson was this fascinating, compelling and complex man, a man that I probably would have had some very interesting conversations with if I'd ever had the chance to meet him. My journey through his world has taken me along many roads in this country and across the battlefields, and on many occasions when I've been on the battlefields with friends who shared my love of Williamson's writing, we've wandered round Railway Wood or across the fields of the Somme, and a pheasant has emerged from the undergrowth, a Phasian bird as Williamson called it, the name of one of his books, his nature books published in the interwar period, or a skylark has been high above us. We've often felt somehow that Williamson was following us or we were following Williamson, I'm not sure which really. And many years ago, when it was largely untouched, I had the privilege of going to his writing hut in Georgium. Williamson bought some land and had a writing hut built, which was a little self-contained building, much bigger than a shed, where it had a fireplace and it had like a mezzanine floor in which he could sleep, and he could live in there and he could write, throw himself into his writing. So to have a chance to come right into the centre of his writing world like that really was quite a thrill. And when I opened the door, down to the left were his old riding boots from when he'd been a transport officer in the machine gun corps, still propped up where he'd left them all those years before. And as I walked towards the fireplace, I saw that on the top was a piece of metal, a metal fixture. And his son, Richard, was there. Richard is most closely like him in appearance and mannerism and the way he talks, particularly about the natural world. A fascinating, truly fascinating man to talk to. And Richard saw me looking at this metal fitting on the fireplace, and he said, "My father used to use that to snuff out candles." And I held it up. I said, "Yeah, I'm sure you can do that with this." I said, "But this is the spike from the top of a German Pickelhaube." And where did Henry pick that up? Where did that come from? Where did Henry bring that back from the battlefields? Williamson was a master of description, a great writer, a truly great writer, who described the battlefields. He chronicled them through his ancient sunlight saga in a way that few have done. For me, from the very first time I read his books, he brought depth to the trails of the Western Front and life and voice to those many faces of the soldiers of the Great War. Williamson was, for me, and will always be, that great chronicler of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.